This is Robotic Disclosure, the program that reveals everything you want to know about robotic surgery, robotic technology, and how to run a best practice robotic program for your hospital, your surgeons, and your patients. And now, here's your host, Josh Feldstein.
We're speaking today with Dr. Rick Feins. Dr. Feins was a practicing cardiothoracic surgeon with more than 30 years of experience. He was formerly head of thoracic surgery at the University of Rochester and the University of North Carolina. And he also served as the medical director of Peri-Operative services at the University of North Carolina from 2014 to 2019. Rick, it's great to have you back on Robotic Disclosure.
Thank you, Josh. It's good to be here.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about a big challenge, a hot spot for many robotic programs, and that are the challenges associated with managing a robotic OR that is not dedicated exclusively to robotic surgery. That would be an operating room that might be split, for example, 50-50 between open cases or lap cases and robot cases. How do you think this impacts the management of the program? Let's start from that perspective.
Well, it can have a tremendous impact on it, and particularly because with the significant expansion in robotic surgery, capacity and access to the robot becomes a very big challenge. It represents a very large investment. So optimal utilization of the robot is really paramount. Now, at the University of North Carolina, we had all of these challenges because we had a rapidly growing program with a lot of demand on a limited number of robots. Our operating room, like most operating rooms, use assigned block times for our surgeons, and there are significant advantages to that, in that the surgeon will know that he or she has a particular amount of time on particular days to use for their surgery. The problem comes up that the robots in our operating room, and in most operating rooms, are confined to a single room. And when you assign that a surgeon to that room, very often our surgeons will have a mixed practice of either robotic and open, or robotic and open and laparoscopic or thoracoscopic surgery. So that block gets assigned to them, and they may only use that block for robotic surgery with the robot in the room for only half of the time. And that means that the robot essentially sits idle in that room for half the time. So that is a very big problem. And we found, when we actually looked at it, that even though access to the robot was a significant problem at North Carolina, the robot itself was not being used maybe 30% of the time because of this. Now, as robotic surgery becomes more and more common, and surgeons are able to fill their entire day with robotic surgery, that problem may become less and less. But at the moment, both here in Chapel Hill and across the country, and colleagues I've spoken to, they all face the same problem with these mixed usage of block allocation.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at a reduction in access by even 30%, which is very, very significant, it means that there are going to be other robotic surgeons who want and need access and can't. So now this creates undue frustration with regard to other surgeons, and the question then becomes, how do you manage the block time planning and access when you have high volume surgeons that may be doing a reasonable amount of robotic surgery, but also doing a fair amount of lap and open surgery, when the other surgeons can't get access to that robot? It leads to dissension among the ranks. This really creates even greater tension problems often between surgeons and administrators. Maybe you can speak to that a little.
Well, the way we tried to handle it, and I think really the only way to handle it, is through the use of release times, and that is by setting up a schedule so that the robotic rooms, if they're not being used for robotic surgery the entire day, that is, the operating room is informed of that, and they can go through some sort of a manipulation to try to optimize that. Now, what is that manipulation? Well, in our case, we released our robotic rooms about 7 days ahead of time, so that if a robot was not, so that if a surgeon in his or her block had scheduled just the morning for robotic and an open case for the afternoon, within 7 days we would have the option of moving that open case into another operating room where open surgery is done. And that can somewhat solve the problem, but it has its own challenges. Probably the biggest challenge that we had is our operating room is running at 100% capacity. So there wasn't an extra room that we could use to move the surgeon to. So instead we had to try to swap. So the surgeon would go out of the robotic room into another room, and hopefully that surgeon would need a robot and would be able to swap in. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen commonly enough to make it workable. The other problem with it is that surgeons really don't like to be operating and sharing rooms with other people, and that gets back to accurate operating times. You wouldn't want to do an operation in the morning on the robot, for example, and then switch to an open room and have to wait an hour, hour and a half for the case ahead of you to finish up. That's a very dissatisfying day because it's a waste of time. So there really are challenges with that. You can improve access, of course, by running in the evening or running on weekends, but that again is not a particularly satisfying situation for most surgeons. But we tried to handle it as best we could by swapping rooms and allowing those people who had robotic cases to come into the robot room, and then finding a place for the open case if the surgeon who had the block was not able to fill it with robotic surgery.
Dr. Feins, who was the person in charge of monitoring and reorganizing or reallocating room access? Was it the robotic coordinator? Was it the director of Peri-Operative services? Who played that oversight and management role?
Well, it was a combination of our scheduling person who understood what the release times were and what the various block allocations were and what other cases were pending throughout the operating room. Our robotic coordinator did play a role in that, and then because of the highly emotional, if you will, status of this situation, I got involved in it quite often also. Again, you don't want to leave a piece of equipment as costly as this not being used for 30% of the time, but sometimes you have to really accept that you're going to have to get more robots just because of the logistics of moving people around and making sure that there's access across the board, and it's only going to get worse for a while. I suspect that robotic surgery will become more and more common to the point where there are plenty of people using a robot for the entire day. There may also be a situation where robots in the robot iterations in the future will become much more mobile, and it can move around in the operating room much as we move operating microscopes and cautery and other pieces of equipment from room to room.
You've raised a number of very interesting questions, and one of them I'd like to circle back on, and that is annual case volumes for a robot. One of the things that our listeners may find of significant interest is that usually somewhere around 325 cases a year on a single robot, access issues, quote unquote, begin to manifest. You're describing some of the challenges with regard to split operating room access. But what happens then is that at 325 cases or so, the alarm bell goes off and it's time for a new robot. And the vendor would, at that point, certainly be eager to open up the discussion about buying, leasing the next robot. But the fact of the matter is that a robot that's doing only 325 cases or so a year, or less for that matter, isn't anywhere near capacity. In fact, we routinely at CAVA see high-performing hospitals with robotic programs with robots in the 500s in terms of numbers of cases per year, and in fact higher. I think the record, as far as I'm aware, is a robot in Asia that does over 800 cases a year. So when you start thinking about programs that are routinely doing 500 and 600 or more cases a year, and then you think about programs that are doing 300 with 30% or greater access reduction and challenges getting on to the robot, that's not an efficient use of that capital expenditure, to your point.
That's quite right. But the other thing I think to keep in mind is that so much of that really is reflected in the efficiency of the room and how the room is being used. If you have a number of surgeons on the learning curve, then your case volume goes down, but the amount of OR time being used by the robot remains quite high. If your turnover times are high, the same thing. If your time from in the room to docking is high. So all of those, I think the first thing everyone needs to do is to optimize that efficiency so that when someone comes into the operating room, they are working, the surgeon is working as efficiently as possible, and the team around him or her is also working that way. Because just the total number of cases may not really reflect optimal utilization of the room.
Optimizing efficiency is huge, and I think the making that a really kind of a paramount focus makes everything better. And then knowing what the potential capacity of a robot is in terms of annual cases, while those cases are optimized in their efficiency, would then lead to really the highest potential ROI. And then, as you'd mentioned, adding the oversight from administrative and clinical leadership, releasing blocks 7 days in advance or according to whatever the policy might be, and making sure that there's eyes on glass, that people are watching all this very carefully and making the accommodations. All these things add up, hopefully, to reducing the strain associated with managing a non-dedicated robotic OR. Would there be any other final comments or suggestions or tips you could suggest, Rick?
Well, I think one of the key physician satisfiers and also one of the keys to efficiency in the operating room is to have a dedicated, well-experienced team. Many ORs do not necessarily supply their robotic room with a dedicated staff, and that particularly is true if the case runs after hours. But there's absolutely no doubt that everybody is happier. The operation goes a lot smoother, and the operation goes much more efficiently and quicker if there is a dedicated team that is trained to do robotic surgery on board. So you can mitigate a little bit of the challenges we talked about capacity by having that, and you certainly make your surgeons a lot happier.
Thank you. We've been speaking today with Dr. Rick Feins, a practicing cardiothoracic surgeon for more than 30 years and formerly medical director of Peri-Operative Services at the University of North Carolina.
You've been listening to Robotic Disclosure, Robotic Disclosure is produced by Kava Robotics International, helping hospitals create profitable, high-quality, best-practice robotic programs in the U.S. and around the world since 2011. Visit kava-robotics.com.